I'm Father Jeffrey Mickler of the Society of St. Paul, and today I'm here with Father George Balasko, an expert in Jewish Christian studies for over 35 years. Today we are going to be discussing St. Paul from the perspective of the biblical scholar Paul Achtemeier. Father George, what was Professor Achtemeyer's main contribution for you to biblical studies of Paul?
Well, one of the classes I attended with him was that he introduced this concept of Paul's conversion was really not a conversion, but the idea that there was a belief that there would be a resurrection at the end of time. But when he experienced Jesus on the way to Damascus, according to Luke, basically that was the moment that a resurrection has taken place, so the new age has begun.
Yeah, and the old age that was past, what was that like?
Well, in the Gnostic movement, there was basically a God of good, and supposedly that was the spirit, and the God of evil, which was in the world as such. And the human being was in between. For the Jewish concept, though, they flattened this out. And in the old age was from Abraham to the coming of the resurrection. You could not sin. Mm-hmm. But with the resurrection in the new age, you would not be able to sin. But with that conversion account now, or the experience of Jesus is risen on the way to Damascus, then he had experienced a resurrection. Then the new age had begun. Mm-hmm. It was only one resurrection, but again, to the Jewish concept, it would be the resurrection of all at the end of time. Yeah. So that's the pivotal point.
So the new age of grace that Paul felt came about with the resurrection of Jesus propelled Paul to bring this good news first to his Jewish brothers and sisters, but then also to the larger world. And what was that larger world like, and how successful or not was he?
Well, the larger world was the Roman world, and going west in the sense with the gospel message, Paul would have to encounter the idea that the emperor was divine. And here we have now there's only one God, the unmentionable name for God in the Jewish tradition, and then Jesus, means Yahweh is Savior, the idea that he had risen from the dead and was experienced as alive. And so basically that concept now has changed the whole world. Now he had to take that out to the Gentiles.
And many times the Greek world, the Hellenistic world, would see the material world as inevitably evil and something to be escaped. But with Paul's understanding of the resurrection, that changed. What was that like?
Well, basically the change was that this world was not evil. It was good in the sense, and that we would be resurrected in the sense of a not just a spiritual world, but a physical resurrection of the body. Okay, so Paul in the sense introduces that concept, not well accepted at Athens when he started to talk about the resurrection from the dead. Mm-hmm. And so basically people were turned off by that, say, well, here yet another time on this, as you can find in the Acts of the Apostles. So basically, that concept then is what is Paul's, I don't want to use the word conversion, because he's still very much attached to what the Jewish concept of God is all about, but the idea that the Gentiles now would leave their paganism and their worship of many gods into this belief in the one God.
Many people don't call the Damascus experience a conversion now. They call it his calling, his vocation into
correct.
this
Probably a little more correct. The nuance is better that way, because everybody thinks that everything else that was before that is to be thrown away. Not necessarily. No, not at all. In fact, it's the continuation of what was revealed to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Moses, especially at Mount Sinai.
The Jewish Paul going into the Gentile world affected his relationship with his fellow Jews pretty deeply. How did that play out in the various conflicts that he had in his life?
Well, when we talk about his fellow Jews, remember there's many Judaisms at this time. It's not this cut and dry of just one group, like within Judaism today you have the Orthodox, the Conservative, the Reform, and the New Age movement and so forth. But basically, what was their different concepts that he was dealing with? It seems that he has a Gentile background, a Jewish background by Gamaliel, which would be a Pharisee background and not a Sadducean background. And so basically with that concept in the sense of a resurrection, angels, afterlife in the sense of very strong in the Pharisee tradition, which is a positive word at the time that Paul is using it today we see it as negative as someone who is a phony or something like that.
I like the end of the Acts of the Apostles. After all the conflicts and the debates, when he gets to the Rome, the Jewish community says, "We haven't heard anything about you," showing how many different segments there were in the Jewish community. And it wasn't like they were all against him. It was a handful of people that didn't experience the resurrection, so they would naturally say the end time has not begun, and there's still sin all through the world. How could you be saying this?
And basically, that's Paul Achtemeier will deal with that in his book on his commentary on the letter to the Romans. So basically, that's my background in the sense of getting my brain open to what happened to Paul and what kind of change took place because he experienced the resurrection. Someone has resurrected. With that, the church has begun. Now the church is a beachhead in that new age. And so the Romans, who would be there in Rome as Christians? You would probably have something like the James community out of Jerusalem, which was probably the foundation of that church in Rome. And then you have Peter and Paul ending up there later on. And Paul, in the sense, very open to the Gentiles. Peter, come and go, because again he had trouble with Cornelius, but then he saw that vision of this blanket coming down, and therefore don't you call unclean what I call clean. And then at Philippi, in the sense of Paul having that conversion of the jailer, who is a Roman, and coming into this belief in Jesus.
When Paul arrived in Rome, he was put under house arrest. He lived in a Jewish community and not far from the current Grand Synagogue in Rome. People feel that he plied his tent-making trade even there because there was a Jewish group of tent makers that made tents along the Tiber, right in the bend of the river there. And so he may have still tried to, in a sense, earn his own keep even while under house arrest.
Yeah. One of my other teachers, we'll get later, would be the idea that as a tent maker, you work with thread and a needle, and actually you can just punch and then start to sew, and you can talk while you're doing this. I know my mom, in the sense, who used to crochet, of happy memory, in the sense, and she can carry on a conversation and not skip a beat, and then the doorway would show up within a couple hours. So basically, Paul, with that occupation as such, was able to support himself, but yet be able to tell the message or share the message.
At the very early part of his ministry, we get the sense that he felt that Jesus was coming back again fairly soon.
Oh, it should have been here yesterday.
Yes. But as the decades rolled by, he adjusted his position, it would seem. How did that play out?
Well, I think Luke does the adjustment in the Acts of the Apostles. We don't see any adjustment to him except when he gets to his later letters, that he realizes that there's going to be some time before the return of Jesus.
Well, one of the hints that I had, even in his own writing, was that he almost was killed a few times, and this sort of brought him to the realization that he might die before Jesus returned.
Oh, true. Okay.
And so that's an interesting little twist, that it never occurred to him that he wouldn't be alive early on when Jesus would return.
I think we owe a lot of that to his publicist by the name of a fellow named Luke in the Acts of the Apostles. Yes. Where his own letters, in the sense, seems to quite a little bit, although he talks about the face-off that he had with Peter up in the area of Asia Minor, in the sense that, but we don't know what Peter responded to him about eating with the Gentiles.
Yes, we have one side of the conversation, which is always a limited side.
And one of the things, in the sense that one of my professors said this, remember when you're reading Paul's letters, it's like opening somebody else's mail. And my mother told me never to do that.
Well, I think that our viewers have to begin to read on their own, first the letters and then the commentaries. I would recommend, for those who are serious students, to look at this classic interpretation given by Paul Achtemeier on the letter to the Romans. But there are many other fine writings as well. What would you say the final word should be on St. Paul today?
St. Paul today, I think we misunderstand him. Basically, we don't know enough about him, in the sense, and he gets a bad rap in the sense of his dealing with women, but that's not his writings. It's probably someone later on writing in the name of Paul.
I think that with that, I could just urge you to turn to the New Testament and encounter Paul for yourself. May God be with you.